Does anyone think these nation states are the best we can do to manage our civilization? These countries with leaders that are antagonizing each other, threatening to blow up the entire world with nuclear weapons. Does any single human being think that this is the best way to organize ourselves? I'm not asking whether or not we can instantly switch to a whole different state of affairs, but if we as a species can ever evolve beyond this security paradigm that has to do with the balance of power. And I guess I'm also asking, how long can we even keep this up before we destroy ourselves? Something like 20 years ago, George Carlin, the wonderfully inspired comedian, was convinced that humanity is on track to self-annihilation. And I would listen to his stand-up and think, oh, he's just being edgy or dark. It's just a rhetorical device. I didn't want to buy into his take because I was always an optimist. And the basis for my optimism was, hey, look how far we've come. And not just us, but look how far the universe has come. You know, it started with just, we don't know exactly how it started, but in the early days of the universe, there were no days, but there were just these unassociated electrons. And that went on for a very long time. And then we had atomic bonds, molecular chemistry, life, speciated life, dynamically balanced ecosystem at the level of the entire planet, which is what we have now. And each one of these stages is using the previously achieved level of complexity as a platform on which to develop itself. Now, as humans, we are the main source of novelty. If you look at the amount of content that we put out through our technology and culture, and I don't see this complexity producing function as being separate from the universal trend. It actually fits perfectly into this asymptotic curve. So, yeah, of course I'm an optimist, because if we are to perish, then who's going to pick up the task of making more and more complicated stuff? That's how I saw it. But of course, a few million years, even a few 100 million years, wouldn't necessarily break this trend, because we're talking about a massive time scale. And that's how long it takes for life, for another species to reach the level of intelligence that we enjoy right now. And if there is a nuclear war, we wouldn't all perish. So we can assume that humanity will bounce back from the level of sticks and stones to making iPhones in something like 1,000 years. Of course, it depends on who makes it, because not all of us can make iPhones from sticks and stones. And of course, there's no reason to assume that this trend of increased novelty will hold. The second law of thermodynamics actually says it won't. And this was also in Carlin's bit about humans that are going away. So, if you're interested in the well-being of our current society, I don't think optimism is the appropriate attitude at this point, and neither is pessimism for that matter. There is, however, a fair amount of intellectual and even spiritual satisfaction to be had from adopting a attitude of realism and pragmatism, so just by focusing on what there is. And I'll resist the urge to go into the metaphysical viewpoint, even though that would cancel most of these existential issues. However, the perspective that we are adopting today is that of a young parent, someone who is very invested in this reality and wants their baby to grow up and live a fulfilling life in a world that is safe and peaceful. And regardless of whether or not you have a young child, I think it's safe to assume that you, the person watching this, would also prefer to live in that kind of a world. However, the challenges in maintaining our relative peace and comfort are growing, and the bigger these challenges are, even if they don't manifest directly, they still affect our well-being. For example, the threat of nuclear war, while it's not as bad as an actual nuclear war, it still will impact our quality of life in a significant way. I mean, fear is never great. And like I said, there are spiritual avenues one may take to let go of fears, but for the purposes of this video we are interested in finding out if we can eradicate the material sources of such fears. So that means scientific methods, observation-based facts and arguments. The world of humans is very segregated, despite having a global economy. And that's because the economy doesn't take the first spot in our list of priorities. So, do you know what does? What is our main priority? Pause to think if you want. It's a little something called national security. Our main priority is to defend ourselves, not from any natural disasters, but from each other. And this security obsession is so deep-seated into the structure of our society that literally nothing can divert attention or resources from that. There's a recent movie that illustrates this perfectly. It's called Don't Look Up. So if we were to find out that an asteroid is on track to hit Earth in 6 months, most, if not all, military conflicts that are currently happening in the world would not stop, provided that the actual soldiers don't find out about the asteroid. Even though we would all die, the fighting would still continue. Another perfect example of our irrational obsession with security is the mutually assured destruction doctrine, which is basically a commitment to end human civilization. Here's a country's government saying, hey, there is a situation in which we are prepared to destroy everyone and everything. This is how important we regard this abstraction that we call United States, Russia, China. I mean, this is how people in charge of the abstraction regard it. So any peace that we have now is achieved through fear of military violence, and not through any economic or social ties. And in the international space, we're all pointing guns at each other's heads, and we call that the balance of power. Now, I suppose the system can work when countries are on speaking terms, but when they start to antagonize each other, when they cut economic ties and public dialogue between nation leaders becomes aggressive, that's when you have a security competition, also known as an arms race. And what that does is divert more and more resources from things like education, healthcare, fixing climate change, to the military. In very extreme cases, the arms race can actually become the singular interest of a country. A historic example is Sparta's policy that was equating a person's overall value with their ability to fight, and deciding that all babies who don't seem like they would make good soldiers will be put to death, because allowing them to live would be a liability in terms of national interest. What makes countries dread the prospect of losing wars, and particularly losing to an invading army? Well, again, historically, if a country was successfully invaded, there would be quite drastic consequences. People would be taken as slaves. The invading army would enjoy the so-called spoils of war, which basically means raping and pillaging. They would set a new administration whose task it would be to make sure that a considerable share of the country's goods are directed back to the conquerors. So the quality of life would plummet so bad. And of course this had a profoundly traumatizing effect on us, to the point that we now regarding destroying the entire civilization as a preferable outcome to being invaded, to losing a war. Now, in modern times we have such a thing as international law. And we have the United Nations, which is supposed to act as this ultimate authority in matters of international politics. However, in practical terms, there's a fundamental distinction between internal laws of a country and international laws, in that if we as citizens break the law, then the government has the authority to correct and punish our behavior. It has the power to do that. At the level of nation states, there is no higher authority. It's almost funny, if it weren't sad, to see these sessions in the Security Council where the representatives are giving grave statements and condemning Russia for its invasion, asking them to immediately and unconditionally withdraw from Ukraine, and that war crimes will be investigated and punished. And watching this, you're almost tempted to think that they have some sort of power, that they wield some sort of consequential material power. Their discourse is so removed from a first principles type of thinking. I mean, it doesn't matter what resolution you adopt and how many times you declare yourself horrified. It doesn't matter. Like Captain Jack Sparrow said in the first Pirates movie, the only thing that matters, I mean, there are just two things that matter: what you can do and what you cannot do. Because in international politics, might makes right. Now you might ask, is that a good thing? Well, it's very naturalistic. This is how things work all across the animal kingdom. The big fish eats the small fish, the powerful prey on the weak. I don't think that in the long term we can continue to survive as a species if this continues to be the norm, especially with all the challenges on our doorstep. Just statistically speaking, if we keep playing with matches, we're bound to start a fire at some point. Now, some may argue that the threat of war has a sobering effect and gets people to work harder. When you're in danger of being attacked, you draw upon all your available physical and mental resources, and you can say that wars have a way of catalyzing innovation. I don't subscribe to the idea that wars are indispensable to human evolution. I think youth can serve as a much greater driving force for that. But of course, for youth to manifest itself into innovation, there needs to be peace, because creativity is inhibited by conflict. And this is true if you have a child growing up in a family where the parents fight a lot, and it's also true in the wider social context. So personally, I do think we should aim to abolish wars, which honestly, even saying it sounds super weird, but let's just continue to see if this is even possible, just for the sake of the argument. So why do wars happen? Do you know? Pause the video to think if you want. This is a question that has been asked all throughout history by strategists, peace researchers, political scientists, maybe even philosophers. And the general consensus is that a country will go to war when the benefits outweigh the disadvantages. So even in this very basic explanation, there's the intrinsic acknowledgement that there are no wars without disadvantages. It's just a matter of the war being perceived as a lesser evil by the country which is starting the war. But of course, the country doesn't perceive anything because it doesn't exist. It's just an abstraction. So a more accurate way of describing how wars originate is to say that when the leaders of the country perceive the advantages of going to war as greater than the disadvantages, then they go to war. And sometimes the interests of the leaders align with the interests of the people whom they lead, but many times they don't. For example, fabricating an external threat in order to consolidate internal power is a very notorious strategy. So the trick is to tell the people that they are in danger, then start the war, and then denounce the pacifists for a lack of patriotism. So far, this has worked flawlessly. Not just when authoritarian leaders did it to delay the end of their regime, but also when a certain superpower that rhymes with the United States did it to pursue liberal hegemony. So the reasons why countries go to war have to do with fear. Sometimes legitimate fear. You see another country arming itself and you're afraid that they might use those weapons against you. Then there's the fear that certain leaders have of losing power, and this only ever applies to authoritarian leaders who have made so many enemies that they can't even conceive living out the rest of their lives without being protected by the state apparatus. So they do everything they can to hang on to power, including start a war with another country. Because in times of war, you can of course invoke emergency measures, impose martial law and all of that. And some people claim that wars are fought for financial reasons, like if the people who make and sell the weapons have an understanding with the politicians. I don't think this is ever a reason to start a war. I think it may be a factor in keeping the wars going. However, the most important thing to note here is that in the overwhelming majority of cases, the people, the actual citizens of the country, they don't want to go to war. It's the leaders that want to go to war. So it would seem like a huge step towards making wars a thing of the past would be to leave the decision up to the people. And this actually was the thinking behind the United States' effort to democratize the world. The idea was that liberal democracies don't want wars, and if they make all countries liberal democracies, then the consequence of that would be world peace. So their national security strategy was literally to achieve world peace by force if necessary, which is kind of ironic, but the idea that democracies are less prone to go to war that's correct. And that's simply because leaders don't dread the time when they're not in power anymore. They don't lose sleep over who might take revenge on them for the many dreadful things they've done. And thus we have what's called a peaceful transition of power. But the idea that you can force a country into becoming democratic, that seems very counterintuitive. Anyway, they tried it. It didn't work. Actually backfired quite a bit. Another thing to mention is that all democracies are liable to become authoritarian countries. All it takes is for the standard of living to drop due to a financial bubble popping or natural disaster or even plain poor management, so that the people are more receptive to divisive extremist ideology. All measurable factors show that democracies provide for a better quality of life, not just from an income per capita perspective, but also if we look at protection of human rights and the propensity for international peace. However, if we did manage to somehow turn all countries into functional democracies, and that's saying quite a lot, national interest would still be the highest priority if we go by the current understanding of what a democratic country is. Still, if we reach that point, it wouldn't be such a huge leap to equate national interest with the well-being of the entire planet. But at this point, you may be thinking to yourself, why are we even talking about this? Like, there's literally no chance of non-liberal countries to change their ways in the foreseeable future. Yeah, I wouldn't blame you for thinking that right now, but I'm curious to see how you think after you'll hear some more of what I have to say. I do want to point out that I'm not a political analyst, nor do I regard the field of politics in general with any particular type of interest, professional or otherwise. My work has to do with designing, writing, and caring for the well-being of computer code. I am a software product manager. That's the official title, but to me it feels like I'm something close to a parent for those things, especially when I get to actually design the functionality from scratch. And if I manage a pre-existing one, I feel like I'm like a legal guardian or foster parent. So I do tend to anthropomorphize software, as you can see. And on any given day of the week, chances are you'll find me writing code. Over the last few years, I've moved towards the distributed or decentralized applications, also known as smart contracts. Now, whatever you think about blockchain and crypto, maybe just put that aside for a bit. But let me say first that, let me acknowledge that this space over the last years, since 2017 to be precise, has been flooded by scams. Scam after scam, pump and dumps, rug pulls. It's like the Wild Wild West. At the same time, there's a growing ecosystem of objectively valuable tools and services, especially in the finance sector. But my perception is that we haven't considered yet the practical advantages that this technology has to offer and its potential to shift our entire way of organizing ourselves. Again, from a first principles perspective, do you know what the main claim to value is for cryptocurrency? Beyond all the hype, what does this technology have to offer that is useful and unique? Pause, think, if you want. So, in one word, consensus. The most important aspect of Bitcoin and all cryptocurrencies is that they allow people to come to a complete and undisputed agreement about what the truth is. And it happens very fast. So instead of having a centralized authority, in this case the bank, telling everybody, hey, this is the truth and you need to trust us, the system makes it so that everybody can verify on their own what the truth is. And this is why cryptocurrency is also known as trustless technology, in that you don't need to trust anybody. And like I said, the centralized authority that is being bypassed by trustless technology right now is the banking system. And Bitcoin has done that over 12 years ago. Because essentially what a bank does is keep a record of who has money and how much they have. That's it. A bank is a glorified ledger. I mean, they do other things, they make some investments, and there's also, historically, they also had the function of protecting your funds against robbery, but nowadays almost all money is digital, so a very small portion is actually printed on paper. And of course, crypto is entirely digital, but it exposed the fact that what banks do, this record-keeping thing, it's not that complicated or expensive, because in the cryptocurrency system, we all do it. So how hard can it be if we all do it? Granted, yes, we do need to spend some energy in the initial iteration of the consensus, which is called proof of work. That requires a fair amount of compute power, but it is demystifying the activity of the bank, and it's saying to it, hey, we're perfectly capable of keeping our own ledger, thank you very much. Now, if you're a centralized authority, like the government of a nation state, you might look at this as a potential threat because countries have such a thing as a national currency, which is controlled through the national bank, and they use that currency to keep the administration running. If people transact in a different currency, that effectively compromises their ability to govern. But so far, the adoption level of crypto has been modest, and the people who do own crypto aren't using it as an alternative to fiat currency, except in a few isolated cases. But generally, people aren't paying for groceries with Ether or Bitcoin. And there's also the fact that crypto-based businesses, like exchanges or trading platforms, they do generate value for governments in the form of taxes. Now, the question is, how does this tax revenue from crypto businesses compare to the tax evasion that crypto is enabling people to engage in? Because as soon as the government gets the sense that the balance is tilted in the unfavorable direction, it starts cracking down on crypto. And a few countries are imposing bans specifically for this reason, but so far most countries tolerate it because it's not being used at a large scale and it doesn't rival the national currency. And frankly, now as I'm speaking, cryptocurrency is not really able to rival national currencies, except in a few cases where the system is really broken down. Like, for example, Venezuela had an economic crisis recently and they did turn to Bitcoin in a very mainstream way. But generally, crypto is not equipped to replace fiat because there's more to centralized currencies than just banks. Yes, we've shown that we can bypass banks, but a country's economy is supported by a wide array of services. Internally, there's a legal framework, along with the means to enforce that legal framework, and internationally, there's diplomacy and there's the military. And there's also international trade conducted directly by the government, in some cases. So if private businesses in a country were to instantly switch to another token to transact goods and services, yes, that would theoretically bankrupt the state institutions, but without a viable way to pass and enforce laws, such a move would be pointless. I sometimes see people passionately advocating for the fall of the establishment, But without considering what comes next and who actually picks up the pieces, this is not a good idea. Because if you don't have an alternate administration, then what comes after the revolution will be just more of the same at best. Now the funny thing is, I mean, not funny like haha, but funny like the interesting thing is that we technically already have what it takes to allow formation of these distributed administrative structures. It's just a matter of implementing their logic into one or more digital products and then getting people to internalize the ideology that is intrinsic of these products. See, I don't believe ideology should be issued in the abstract. I think it should stem from existing technological capabilities. Instead of working backwards from someone's vision of utopia, we can just base our administrative model on what we can do right now. And right now, we have the technical bedrock for building real decentralized governance in the form of Turing-complete blockchains like Ethereum and low-cost consensus like proof of stake or even delegated proof of stake. So that last part means less energy consumption to collectively agree on what the truth is, and Turing-complete just means being able to perform logical operations. A Turing-complete consensus network doesn't just agree on the state of the ledger, which keeps track of wallet balances, but also allows the participants to agree on the result of any logical operation, no matter how complex. Here's a good analogy of how that works. You're a student sitting in math class, and the teacher writes a problem on the board, a math challenge, and asks everyone to work individually, and once the students are done, the results are compared, and what the majority has as the result is deemed as the truth. Now, having this capability on top of the financial system allows cryptocurrency to take on a regulatory function, because these problems that we all solve and then compare notes, they result in monetary transactions. So that means you can specify the terms that dictate the economic interactions, but instead of having lawyers write these terms, we just put them into computer code, and instead of relying on the justice system to enforce them, they are self-enforcing, because all the participants of this economy ensure that the code is executed as intended. And this is why they're called smart contracts. Let me give you an example. Estate planning is a legal service that manages a person's assets if they are incapacitated or dead. The way that works is very simple. You go to an estate planning lawyer and they write up a contract, a will, which specifies how your inheritance is allocated to the heirs. Now, after that, you pay a recurring fee to someone who is called the executor of your will. It might be the same person as the lawyer, it might be someone else, but their role is to execute the will when the time comes. The market for this type of service, for multi-generational trust funds, or the estate planning market, is very big. Last year it was almost $200 billion just in the United States. Now, a decentralized version of this service would be to just put your will in a smart contract that sends the inheritance to your heirs. You specify their wallets and how much they each get. And if you don't check in for a period of time, which you can define how long, so you need to check in, for example, every 3 months or so. If you don't check in, that is automatically sent. That's a very simple example of how this tech can replace traditional legal services. And this is one app that I've actually built. It's called After Me. I built it like 2 years ago, and you can find it at deathisreal.com. So if we go up the chain of authority in terms of legal documents, above contracts we have laws, and one step above laws we have constitutions of nation states. Now, using smart contracts to automate estate planning, that's fine. But how do we go from that to replacing the entire mechanism, not just the legislative branch, but also the executive branch of government? And furthermore, do it in a way that is both decentralized and time efficient. Because the main the main advantage, if you were to ask someone like Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, if you were to ask him why dictatorship is superior to democracy, he would say, he actually did make this argument, that the dictatorship is quick, while democracy spend time deciding and arguing to reach consensus. The dictatorship can decide and move to execute much faster. And yes, I do think that is somewhat of a valid point. However, I think that the trade-off is very much worth it. I mean, yes, it takes a little bit longer to make decisions, but statistically speaking, those decisions are more likely to serve the interests of the people and also avoid corruption. Not just within the state institutions, but also at the very top, where the one person that is in charge has their moral compass broken by prolonged exposure to power. And especially to this kind of power, which is very different from that of democracy's head of state, for example. You need to understand that in a dictatorship, the person at the top is leading all state institutions, so there's no chance of them being investigated for things like killing, raping. So that kind of power will just eat away at your humanity and sanity, to the point where you may be convinced that you are the only true instrument for enacting God's divine plan, and you need to put all your country's efforts into unstoppable weapons of mass destruction, like hypersonic glide vehicles or with nuclear warheads, but also conduct some research and development to clone your sperm at scale and pack it into portable artificial inseminators, so that once you do take over the world with your huge army, you can impregnate every woman in the world with your children, because that's the only way you can purify an otherwise decadent world. The only way we can effectively denazify the world is with an entire generation of your offspring. All the people will be the children of the supreme leader, the biological children. Conception by any other father is outlawed, and bastard children are immediately sentenced to death. Technology could preserve this type of regime by spotting and eliminating all dissident tendencies from their infancy. Neural interfaces would monitor everyone's cognitive processes, scanning for patterns of ill will towards the great father, who, by the way, at this point has no reason to worry about biological decay of old age, because he has access to bespoke genetic treatments and can prolong his life indefinitely. So anyone who as much as thinks any non-flattering thoughts about the leader will be removed from society. This got dark very fast, didn't it? But you want to understand, this is the nature of the beast. If you think this is some kind of sci-fi dystopian fantasy, well, most likely you live in a democracy, and the only reason you think this scenario is unrealistic is because you are so far removed from, from the nature of dictatorship. But for people living in authoritarian countries with authoritarian rulers, this sounds painfully plausible. And even if people are 100% compliant and they all submit to the authority of the supreme ruler, after he impregnated all the women, and after he implanted chips in all our brains and monitoring every thought, he would still be paranoid. He would still imagine plots against him, and his paranoid delusions would serve as legitimate evidence to convict people, and he would preemptively instill terror. And at a certain point, when the weight of his soul, or let me put it another way, when his subconscious grief would be too heavy to bear, he would turn to nihilism, and his bitter ego would collapse onto itself, and just like a jealous lover, he would resent the world for not quenching his vain need for being adored. In an ultimate crime of passion, he would blow up the world. This type of behavior is not relegated to a specific type of person. This is the nature of the pathologically inflated human ego. And our history is well acquainted with it. You think Genghis Khan wouldn't have used brain-computer interfaces to hang on to power? Or you think if Nero, the Roman emperor, had nukes, he wouldn't have used them? Or Xerxes? Or Ivan the Terrible? Or Hitler? We have a long history of ruthless leaders, but we've had these weapons, these world-ending weapons, for a very short time. But our technology as a whole is posing a fundamental fork in our destiny. If control of our technology is centralized, there's a real chance that the gap in power between the leaders and the masses might never be bridged. Because you want to understand that automation makes human labor irrelevant. So while in the past you needed humans to have a functional economy, this won't necessarily be the case anymore in the future. That was a very substantial tangent, but the point is that I want to make is that yes, I think it's totally worth it to reach decisions a bit slower, but avoid centralized command and control. And fortunately, as I was saying earlier, we don't even need to make that trade-off, because we can use distributed equilibrium algorithms to supercharge the democratic process. Now, I've been speaking for a while, and I still didn't tell you the details of how we can implement a fully distributed governance mechanism at the level of nation states and ultimately at the level of our entire civilization. So maybe let me do that. I want to introduce the concept of a DAO. DAO stands for the Decentralized Autonomous Organization. I am a member of multiple DAOs. The one that I resonate with the most, and the one that I also through which I conduct most of my recent activity, it's called dorg.tech. You can find it at www.dorg.tech. You don't need to put the W these days. Anyway, we're a bunch of IT professionals that we behave just in the market just like a traditional dev shop. Clients come to us to build different products, and we organize into teams, build and deliver. We work exclusively on Web3 projects, so just smart contracts. Now, the main difference between us and a traditional dev shop is that we have a truly flat hierarchy. Internal decisions are made by democratic consensus, and because our entire operating model is prescribed in smart contracts, there is no chance of anyone abusing or misusing our internal administration. We all pay taxes. I mean, in addition to being an LLC and paying taxes to the state, we pay taxes internally. So 10% of what we earn goes to the treasury. And the money that accumulates in the treasury serves to cover our communal expenses, but also to fund for internal projects. These internal projects can be anything, and any member can propose an internal project. If the DAO approves it, then it is funded. If the DAO also can decide to cut funding to any existing internal project if it feels like the work that is being done is not worthy of the resources. So maybe you can spot the difference between this governance model and a system where the extent of your control is just to pick who will be in charge for a period of 4 years or so. Now, since joining Dorg last year, I've been looking into various products that are out there for DAO administration. And this particular vertical is kind of trending right now. I would say that DAOs are to this year what NFTs were to last year. And NFTs are profoundly stupid, in my opinion. I mean, for the 99.9% of the use cases that they're currently being advertised and adopted. But DAOs are a very different story. So I've been looking at products in this space, but I couldn't find a DAO tool or a DAO framework that covers not just the internal administration, but also the interactions between DAOs. So I made an internal proposal at Dorg and got it approved and started building it. I actually delivered the first version just last week. So the MVP. If you want to watch a 5-minute walkthrough of how that works, I'll put a link in the description. Now, this is primarily intended at the moment to serve our workflow, But while working on this, I've had more and more pieces fall into place for how we might incorporate our private sector and the territorial administration into an ecosystem of DAOs that trade goods and services with each other, but also arbitrate potential disputes that they might have, that they're more than likely to have in the course of their interactions. There are two key pieces in this puzzle. One is identity management. So just like we can prevent double spending in cryptocurrency, we need to find a solution to prevent double voting while still preserving privacy. As of right now, identifying people even in the Web3 space relies on government issued identities. So you upload your passport or your ID card along with a recent utility bill, and that's how this is the state of the art at the moment. But of course, this is not a viable solution for obvious reasons. I mean, you can't not rely on the very thing that you're trying to replace. But I do think I have a fairly crystallized and detailed concept of how to implement identity management, and I'll make a video for that. A separate video just for that. The other big piece of the puzzle is automation in the executive branch of government. So earlier I gave the example of distributed app that for estate planning. The reason that can work today is because the entire execution happens on chain. It's just a matter of transferring funds from the account of the deceased to the accounts of the heirs, and it's the user's job to periodically check in and let the smart contract that they're still alive. So the app doesn't need to interact with anything outside of the blockchain. Now, of course, our lives are off-chain. We don't live on the blockchain. So we need a way to enforce what is specified in the smart contracts that make up our legislator. This, I can tell you, is the most fascinating challenge that I've ever personally come across. I'll make a separate video for this as well. And I want to mention one more thing. An enabling factor for this transition is the globalization of our workforce. We've had a global economy for a while, but now, due to the advent of remote work, companies can hire professionals from anywhere in the world, which is kind of a first in our history. Never have we had professional communities, teams of people working completely separate from each other, geographically distributed all across the world. And this phenomenon serves to decrease not just nationalism, but the overall incentive of war, because our livelihood is tied to that of our international co-workers. Still, in their current form, it's very likely that nation states would see this as a liability of national security if it compromises their ability to conduct wars, unfortunately. So this is why we might want to think about changing these countries for something else. I mean, not just for this, but also to keep ourselves busy. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.